Jasmine Crockett found herself in the kind of public moment where a sudden, sharp interruption threatened to derail everything. The room was a familiar tableau of polished wood and hushed anticipation, the air thick with the low hum of ventilation and the barely perceptible tension that always precedes important testimony. She stood at the microphone, her notes laid precisely before her, her voice steady as she articulated a complex point about oversight and accountability, a point born of deep research and a commitment that felt personal in its intensity. Her gaze was level, directed towards the panel, conveying authority not through volume but through clarity and conviction. She had built her remarks carefully, brick by brick, anticipating potential challenges, steeling herself for the inevitable pushback. But the nature of the interruption, when it came, was not the intellectual jousting she'd prepared for. It was a cut, swift and dismissive, slicing through her sentence before she could land the crucial clause. A voice from across the aisle, laced with impatience and something colder, sharper, something that felt less like a procedural objection, and more like a raw denial of her right to occupy the space, to command the air. The words themselves were almost secondary. It was the timing, the tone, the deliberate erasure of her voice mid-thought that struck first. A lesser person might have flinched, stumbled, lost their place, or reacted with a flash of anger. The protocol, the expectation, even the basic human impulse would have been to defend the space, to push back immediately against the intrusion. But Jasmine did none of those things. She simply stopped speaking, not abruptly, not with a gasp, but with a controlled pause, a stillness that descended over her like a mantle. Her eyes remained fixed on the panel for a beat, then shifted almost imperceptibly towards the source of the voice, not with challenge, but with an unnerving calm. The interruption hung in the air, a jarring discord in the carefully orchestrated quiet of the room, but her stillness magnified it, turning the brief outburst into an extended, awkward silence. It was a silence she did not fill, a silence that invited the room, the cameras, the unseen audience to witness the nature of the interaction. Her hands, resting lightly on the podium, did not clench or gesture. They remained perfectly still, anchored and serene. The digital clock on the wall seemed to tick louder in that pause, each second amplifying the unspoken dynamic unfolding. It wasn't defiance in her posture, not yet. It was observation. It was an immediate, almost intuitive assessment of the power play, the attempted diminishment. In that moment of forced quiet, she registered the slight shift in the room. A few heads turning, a ripple of surprise on a staffer's face, the slight leaning forward of a reporter in the press section. Her own heartbeat remained steady, a quiet drumbeat beneath the sudden surge of adrenaline that the unexpected challenge brought. She allowed the silence to stretch, a silent assertion that her voice, once interrupted, would not be easily reclaimed or rushed. This was not just about finishing her sentence. It was about acknowledging, without comment, the deliberate nature of the silencing attempt. The politician's voice faded, perhaps realizing the effect of the sudden quiet, perhaps not. The moment felt suspended, a tiny pocket of time outside the usual flow of debate, defined entirely by her refusal to immediately engage with the provocation. She held their gaze for another beat, letting the weight of the interruption settle, not just on her but on the room itself. The silence after the interruption wasn't empty. It was charged. It pulsed with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened. Across the aisle, the politician who had interrupted shifted in his seat, perhaps uncomfortable under the sudden, unexpected weight of the stillness, or perhaps simply oblivious. The sound of a cleared throat somewhere in the audience seemed impossibly loud. Jasmine's aide, seated just behind her, leaned forward slightly, a question in their eyes. Should I object? Should we push back? A question Jasmine answered with the slightest shake of her head, a movement so small it was barely discernible, a silent command for restraint. Her focus remained outward, encompassing the room, the panel, but also, in a way, the larger, invisible audience. She felt the heat of the lights, the low thrum of the recording equipment, the weight of expectation. The instinct to defend, to retort, to immediately reclaim the floor was powerful, almost primal, but she consciously pushed it down. That reaction, she knew, was exactly what the interruption was designed to provoke, an emotional response that could be dismissed as shrill, as overly sensitive, as simply another partisan squabble. Her strength, she understood, lay not in mirroring the energy directed at her, but in holding her own ground with unwavering calm. She took a slow, measured breath, her chest rising and falling imperceptibly. This wasn't just about a disrespectful colleague. It was about a pattern, a strategy often deployed to diminish voices like hers. To react in kind would be to validate the tactic, to enter the fray on terms not of her choosing. Instead, she chose a different path, the path of amplified stillness, of foregrounded dignity. She let her gaze sweep slowly across the panel, ensuring they registered the moment, ensuring they saw not a politician bested by an interruption, but one who chose to absorb it, process it, and hold it up for silent examination. There was no anger flashing in her eyes, no visible frustration, only a profound, almost unsettling composure. The politician mumbled something under his breath, perhaps trying to fill the void, perhaps justifying his action to a neighbor, but his words were swallowed by the silence she was cultivating. A few journalists in the back began typing furiously on their laptops, the click of keys sharp in the quiet. This moment, unintended by the interrupter, was becoming something else entirely, a tableau of attempted silencing, meeting unyielding composure. It was a microdrama playing out in real time, and Jasmine, by her deliberate inaction, was controlling the narrative, forcing everyone in the room to confront the disrespect without her having to utter a single word about it. She allowed herself a fraction of a second to feel the unfairness of it, the sheer tedium of having to constantly navigate these calculated slights, but that feeling was quickly compartmentalized, set aside in favor of strategic calm. She adjusted her glasses slightly, a small, deliberate movement in the otherwise frozen frame. The world outside the hearing room continued, oblivious, but within these four walls, time had momentarily warped around the silence, turning a brief discourtesy into a significant event. She was not just standing there, she was performing patience, demonstrating a level of control that starkly contrasted with the impulsive outburst that had triggered it. The moment stretched, defined by Jasmine's quietude. It was a deliberate act of resistance, not through defiance, but through the refusal to be rushed, to be flustered, to cede control of her own rhythm. The politician who had interrupted remained still now, perhaps sensing the unexpected gravity his action had inadvertently created. His earlier bluster seemed to evaporate in the sustained silence. On the dais, the committee chair shifted uncomfortably, clearing their throat again, glancing between Jasmine and the clock. The usual flow of a hearing demanded forward momentum, a quick resolution to any disruption, but Jasmine's stillness defied that expectation. She wasn't waiting to be given permission to continue. She was waiting for the interruption's echo to dissipate, for the air to clear on her terms. She wasn't just standing at a microphone. She was anchoring the entire room, forcing everyone to wait with her, to inhabit the space that the disrespect had created. Her eyes, calm and clear, met the gaze of a colleague across the aisle who offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of support, a silent acknowledgement of the dynamic at play. This wasn't just about one person interrupting another. It was about whose voices were habitually given space and whose were routinely cut short, about the power dynamics embedded in the very structure of public discourse. By not reacting with anger, by not engaging in a tit-for-tat exchange, she was highlighting the nature of the interruption itself, stripping away any veneer of legitimate debate and exposing it for what it was, an attempt to silence. The cameras remained trained on her, capturing the stillness, the unwavering gaze, the subtle but profound power of her restraint. This wasn't a performance for the cameras, but the cameras were recording the performance of dignity under duress. The politician who interrupted finally spoke again, his voice lower this time, perhaps offering a weak justification or a procedural point, but Jasmine didn't acknowledge him directly. Her attention remained distributed across the room, a quiet command of the space. She allowed his second, softer interjection to also hang unanswered for a beat, reinforcing the message that she would not be easily diverted or drawn into a back and forth that would only serve to diminish her original point. Her hands remained still on the podium, a visual symbol of her groundedness. The notes before her remained undisturbed, a testament to her preparation and focus. a silent contrast to the impulsiveness of the interruption. She was demonstrating without speaking that her time, her words, and her presence commanded respect, and that attempts to undermine them would not go unnoticed or unaddressed in the way the aggressor likely intended. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding that something more significant than a procedural spat was occurring. This was a quiet assertion of power, a refusal to be made small, a demonstration that composure could be a more potent force than confrontation. The ripple of awareness began to spread beyond the immediate confines of the hearing room. A staffer in the back, phone tucked discreetly under the table, had captured the initial interruption, the beat of silence, and the politician's subsequent awkward attempts to justify himself. That short clip, devoid of commentary, was already being shared in hushed DMs and discreet group chats. The sheer visual contrast, the politician's sudden, sharp outburst versus Jasmine's unwavering stillness and calm gaze, was stark and compelling. Within minutes, screenshots were circulating, focusing on the politician's expression in the moment of interruption and Jasmine's serene composure in its wake. The narrative was beginning to write itself, not just among those present, but in the digital space that was a constant, invisible witness to these proceedings. The word disrespect began appearing in early social media posts referencing the incident. Cut off, interrupted, mansplaining. Though the term wasn't always strictly accurate in this specific instance, the feeling of attempted diminishment resonated with that familiar pattern. The language quickly coalesced around the idea of an unfair power dynamic at play. Jasmine, still at the microphone, remained seemingly focused on her notes, although she was acutely aware of the shift in the room's energy. The heightened attention now focused not just on her testimony, but on her. She felt the weight of eyes upon her, different from the usual scrutiny. This was eyes watching for a reaction, for a crack in the facade, for the moment she might finally break her composure. But she offered none. Her voice, when she finally resumed speaking, was low, measured, and entirely devoid of emotion. No anger, no defensiveness, no tremor. It was simply the voice of someone picking up exactly where they had been forcibly stopped, giving the distinct impression that the interruption was merely a minor, irrelevant noise that she was calmly stepping over. She didn't acknowledge the politician, didn't reference the pause, didn't alter her tone to convey displeasure. She simply continued with her prepared remarks, allowing the substance of her argument to reclaim the air. This deliberate, almost icy calm was more effective than any angry retort could have been. It suggested that the interruption was so beneath her notice, so lacking in substance, that it didn't even warrant acknowledgement. It wasn't defiance, it was dismissal. The politician who had interrupted looked increasingly uncomfortable, fidgeting in his seat, glancing at his own notes, then back at Jasmine. He had attempted to disrupt her flow, to silence her voice, and in doing so, had only amplified her presence and highlighted his own lack of control. The visual symbol of her still hands, the clear, unblinking gaze, the steady, uninterrupted flow of her voice after the break. These were the elements that were now silently communicating far more powerfully than any verbal exchange could. The moment truly solidified its hold on the public consciousness when the short clip landed on a widely followed social media account, shared not by a news outlet, but by an observer, accompanied by minimal text. The caption simply read, "Watch how she handles this." The viral quote, the line that would come to define the moment, wasn't an angry clapback from Jasmine, or even a direct response to the politician. It emerged subtly, almost incidentally, several minutes later, woven into the fabric of her continued testimony. As she reached a particularly critical point in her remarks, building her argument with calm precision, she paused, not because she was interrupted this time, but deliberately for emphasis. And then she delivered a line that, in isolation, sounded like a simple statement about the topic at hand, but in the context of the preceding events, landed like a soft, precise hammer blow. Without looking at the politician, without raising her voice, she said, "We cannot afford to be distracted by noise when the integrity of the process is at stake." The word noise hung in the air, carrying the quiet weight of everything that had just transpired. The interruption, the disrespect, the attempted derailment. It was a single sentence, seemingly innocuous within the broader context of her testimony, But online, clipped and shared, it became the definitive statement of the event. It was a perfect example of a delayed rhetorical hammer, a line delivered calmly and deliberately, long after the initial provocation, reframing the entire interaction not as a personal slight, but as an attempt to inject noise into a serious discussion about integrity. The clip of her saying that line, often paired with the earlier clip of the interruption, went supernova. It wasn't angry, it wasn't loud, it was simply true and devastatingly effective. It shifted the focus from the politician's action to the quality of his action, labeling it as mere noise. The subtlety was its power. It didn't name-call or attack. It simply categorized the behavior in a way that was impossible to argue with. Who could defend introducing noise when integrity was at stake? The comment sections exploded. People who had never heard of the politician, or perhaps even Jasmine herself, were drawn in by the clip, by the sheer composure of her response, by the elegant, quiet power of that single line. She called him noise, one comment read, followed by a dozen fire emojis. This is how you handle disrespect, another stated. Dignity is a superpower, wrote a third. The conversation wasn't about who was right or wrong on the policy point. It was about the fundamental dynamics of respect, power, and presence. Jasmine, still in the hearing, likely wasn't scrolling through social media, but the palpable shift in the room, the increased number of phones visible, the wide eyes of staffers communicated the scale of the moment building outside. She finished her testimony with the same calm precision, the viral line now an unspoken undercurrent to every word she spoke, echoing in the minds of those watching, both in the room and online. The moment had become a phenomenon, a case study in how grace under pressure could dominate an attempted power play. News outlets, initially focused on the substance of the hearing, pivoted to cover the viral clip. Articles appeared with headlines referencing Jasmine Crockett's masterful response, calling out the noise and dignity in the face of disrespect. The narrative was no longer just about an interruption. It was about Jasmine Crockett's handling of the interruption. Her name was trending, linked to the clip, to the quote. The politician who had interrupted was now being widely criticized, not just for the interruption itself, but for exposing himself to such a devastatingly calm, effective reframing. His attempt to silence her had inadvertently given her a larger platform and a clearer message than she might have otherwise achieved in that specific moment. The contrast was stark, his fleeting, petulant outburst against her enduring, composed power. Online discussions debated the meaning of noise in this context. Was it just about interrupting? Or was it coded language for something deeper, something about whose voices were considered legitimate contributions and whose were dismissed as irrelevant distractions? The debate amplified the power of Jasmine's chosen word, forcing a deeper engagement with the underlying dynamics of the interaction. People shared their own experiences of being interrupted, dismissed, or treated as noise in professional settings, seeing their own frustrations reflected and validated in Jasmine's response. Her restraint wasn't just personal, it felt representative of a broader experience. Even those who disagreed with her politically found it difficult to fault her composure in that specific moment. Her dignity transcended partisan lines, appealing to a more fundamental sense of fairness and respect. Meanwhile, Jasmine went about her duties. There were meetings, constituent calls, legislative work. She didn't immediately issue a statement or go on a media tour to discuss the incident. That would have felt reactive, and her strength in this situation was her deliberate, delayed response. She allowed the viral moment to build, to generate its own momentum, to force the public conversation around the themes of respect and noise. She understood that the power of the moment wasn't in her explaining it, but in the world interpreting it through the lens of her calm. The sheer volume of attention, the countless shares and comments, signaled a deep public resonance with the idea that maintaining one's dignity, refusing to sink to the level of the aggressor, was not weakness, but a profound form of strength. The politician who had interrupted, perhaps urged by his staff, issued a brief boilerplate statement referencing spirited debate and the cut and thrust of politics, but it landed flat, completely failing to address the core issue of disrespect and sounding, ironically, like more noise against the clarity of Jasmine's quiet reframing. Later, away from the immediate glare of the hearing room. Perhaps in her office or during a quiet moment between events, Jasmine allowed herself to process the magnitude of the moment. An aide showed her the viral clip, the commentary, the sheer volume of reactions. There was no triumphant smile, no outward display of vindication. Instead, there was a quiet knowing, a recognition that the strategy of stillness, of letting the disrespect hang in the air, had worked precisely as intended. The goal wasn't to embarrass the politician in a petty sense, but to expose the nature of the power dynamic, to highlight the attempted erasure of her voice, and to do so in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed. The viral quote, "We cannot afford to be distracted by noise when the integrity of the process is at stake," was dissected and analyzed, its layers revealing themselves. It wasn't just about the specific interruption. It was about all the noise that often surrounds substantive issues, designed to distract, to divide, to prevent real work from being done. It spoke to the constant effort required to cut through that noise, to maintain focus on what truly matters, the integrity of the institutions, the process, the commitment to public service. She understood that her composure in that moment had resonated because it offered an alternative model of power, one based not on aggression or volume, but on dignity, clarity, and unwavering focus. She hadn't fought fire with fire. She had met fire with an unyielding, calm surface that revealed the fire's destructive nature without being consumed by it. The emotional ripple effect was significant. For countless individuals who had experienced similar microaggressions, her response was a validation of their own struggles and a powerful example of how to reclaim agency in such moments. It wasn't about teaching someone a lesson through anger, but through the sheer, undeniable force of one's presence and dignity. The politician, caught in the unexpected storm of public criticism, found himself forced to confront the unintended consequences of his actions, the quiet power of a response that refused to play by his rules. His attempted dominance had been met not with submission or outrage, but with a calm, strategic pivot that turned the spotlight back on him, exposing the noise of his behavior. In a controlled setting, perhaps a planned interview or a statement made not in the heat of the moment but hours later, Jasmine addressed the incident directly, but without dwelling on the personal slight. She spoke not about the politician by name, but about the broader patterns of behavior that undermine the legislative process. Her tone remained calm, reflective, and powerful. She reiterated the importance of focusing on substance over spectacle, of ensuring all voices are heard, and of maintaining the integrity of the democratic process. She might echo the sentiment of her viral quote, explaining its meaning in a slightly different context, reinforcing the idea that attempts to derail serious discussion are simply noise. This wasn't a defensive posture. It was an offensive one, not in the sense of attacking, but in the sense of proactively shaping the narrative and defining the terms of the discussion. She talked about the responsibility of elected officials to model respectful discourse, even in disagreement. She framed the incident not as a personal victory, but as a reminder of the ongoing work required to uphold the standards of public service. Her language was precise, measured, and free of hyperbole. She didn't express anger or resentment. She expressed a quiet determination to continue doing the work, regardless of the obstacles or the noise. This delayed, dignified response cemented her position as the one who had handled the situation with grace and strength. It moved the conversation beyond the initial viral moment, prompting deeper reflection on the nature of respect, power, and dignity in public life. It was a masterclass in controlling one's own narrative, not by reacting impulsively, but by choosing the time, place, and language that best served the larger message. The reevaluation by the audience was complete. This wasn't just a politician being interrupted. This was an attempt to diminish a powerful voice being met with an even more powerful display of composure and strategic communication. The aftermath of the viral moment led to a broader public reevaluation, not just of that specific interruption, but of similar dynamics that play out constantly in public life, often unnoticed or dismissed. People began pointing to other instances of women, particularly women of color, being interrupted, talked over, or treated dismissively in professional or public settings. Jasmine's calm response became a touchstone, a point of reference for how dignity could be maintained and how power could be asserted without resorting to aggression. The politician who had interrupted faced continued scrutiny, his name now often associated with the viral clip and the quiet power of Jasmine's reaction. His attempts to pivot or downplay the incident only served to highlight the stark contrast with her composed handling of the situation. The incident served as a public lesson, televised and amplified by social media, on the nature of microaggressions and the subtle ways power can be wielded to silence or diminish others. Jasmine didn't need to deliver a fiery speech or a public dressing down. Her quiet resilience, her deliberate pauses, and her carefully chosen words delivered the message far more effectively. The visual symbol of her stillness at the podium, her clear gaze cutting through the noise, became iconic for many. It was a powerful counterpoint to the often loud, often aggressive nature of political discourse. Her choice to name the interruption as noise, a distraction from integrity, resonated deeply because it captured the feeling of countless people who feel their own substantive contributions are often drowned out by performative gestures or deliberate disruptions. The narrative had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer about the politician's brief moment of dominance, but about Jasmine's enduring display of strength and clarity. She hadn't been embarrassed. She had, through her dignified response, illuminated the politician's behavior in a way that caused him far greater discomfort than any direct confrontation could have achieved. The emotional reward for the audience was not just seeing a moment of disrespect called out, but seeing it handled with a level of grace and intelligence that felt genuinely empowering. Her restraint became the focal point, sparking conversations about the different forms power can take and the unexpected places where true strength can be found. In the quiet moments following the public storm, Jasmine reflected on the event not as a personal triumph over an opponent, but as a stark illustration of the dynamics she and others constantly navigated. The viral clip, the widespread discussion, the praise for her composure. It was all a testament to the fact that people recognized the noise and yearned for integrity. She felt no deep animosity towards the politician, only a weary understanding of the forces at play. Her strength, she knew, didn't come from a need to dominate or embarrass, but from a deep well of purpose and a refusal to be diverted from the work that mattered. The incident had reinforced her belief that sometimes the most powerful response is not a loud one, but a quiet, unwavering commitment to truth and dignity. She looked at her folded hands, still now in the silence of her office, remembering how they had remained steady on the podium. That stillness had been a shield, a statement, a grounding force. The viral line, "We cannot afford to be distracted by noise when the integrity of the process is at stake," echoed in her mind, not as a clever comeback, but as a fundamental truth about the challenges of meaningful progress. The emotional ripple effect continued, inspiring conversations in homes, workplaces, and online spaces about how to respond to microaggressions, how to maintain composure under pressure, and how to value dignity above reactivity. The incident had been an unplanned crucible, and from it had emerged a clearer understanding of the quiet, potent power of restraint. It was a power that didn't seek to destroy, but to illuminate, to reframe, and to ultimately strengthen the foundation upon which meaningful dialogue could occur, free from the corrosive effects of noise. The story of the interruption and the composed response was not just about one moment in a hearing room. It was a universal narrative about facing disrespect and choosing a higher path, proving that dignity is not merely the absence of outward struggle, but a profound, active force in itself. If this story moved you, share it, not to go viral, but to remind people what dignity looks like.